research is increasingly showing us just how vulnerable they are, how much even quite light violence can impact on their development. So, to me, the illogicality is in drawing this protective circle not round the child, but round the adult who assaults the child. Every country has criminal laws on assault. The anomaly is that those laws do not apply equally to protect children in the home and everywhere else. They used not to protect women. Now we've changed that. So why are we waiting to protect children? I think the countries which have gone ahead and banned all corporal punishment in all settings, they're not really passing some new special particular law to protect children from a special form of violence. What they're doing is extending the protection that the criminal law on assault gives to everyone except children, to cover children. That's what the reform is about. And I often have to get across to people that corporal punishment is not just a special form of violence, disciplinary violence. It is assault. Any other definition of the law on assault, corporal punishment would come into it, except that we have these excuses that then defend reasonable chastisement. It's all our English law, of course, that's where it mostly came from, and before us, Roman law. There's no escaping the fact that what we want, the logical position, is that the criminal law on assault applies equally to all assaults on children, whether they are disguised as discipline or not. But criminalising corporal punishment in the home, of course, does not mean that we want to see more parents prosecuted, fined, sent to prison, because that would not help children. The positive purpose of all law should be to educate, to move people on. A lot of people think the law is there to punish, and that's its major purpose. But of course, it's too late, from a child's point of view, if they're being hurt, to wait for prosecution. It's all happened. What we want is a clear law that sends a very clear message that it's no more acceptable or lawful to hit a child than to hit anyone else. But having that clear message does not mean that we have to use the law in a punitive way against parents, because that would not help children. But if we start to say, let's not make it a criminal offence, let's just say it's a bad idea, then we're not giving children equal protection. We're confusing people again and suggesting that children need less legal protection than adults. One of the problems of the bans in many countries is that governments have not linked law reform to comprehensive public education, parent education, teacher education. And of course, law reform on its own is not going to achieve the sort of change of attitudes and practice which we need. Sweden is really the only country which has systematically researched the impact of their successive moves to outlaw corporal punishment, which ended in the explicit ban in 1979, over 30 years ago now. It's quite clear from the Swedish research that it has, because it was linked to public and parent education on a very big scale, that it has led to a huge change in both attitudes and practice, and so to much less punitive violence against children in the family. Sweden is the only country also which has commissioned this sort of interview research with parents and with children. And of course, the only way you can tell what is really happening to children is by asking them and their parents in conditions of trust and confidentiality. Reporting levels of violence tell you nothing about what's really happening. Some people peddle gross misinformation about the effects of the reform in Sweden, saying, for instance, I've seen reports suggesting that child abuse went up 500% after Sweden passed its anti-spanking law. This is complete rubbish. What did happen is that reporting of violence against children went up, and that, of course, is a positive sign. It shows a greater sensitivity to violence against children in society. We want that. Prosecution of parents did not increase. Formal intervention in families did not increase, but the sensitivity to violence did increase, and certainly that's led to a lessening in practice. I think, there are two ways for the US to go. You can compromise, you can try and find incremental ways of moving towards a complete ban. To me, that's what politicians are quite likely to do, but it's not how I see the role of advocates for children. I think, you have to keep to the clarity and logic and humanity of the issue, which is that children have a right to the same legal and other protection from being hit as everyone else. If you depart from that sort of advocacy, you lose all the arguments of principle, and you're not left with that much. You're left with the research that increasingly demonstrates the harm that corporal punishment can do, but then you also have minority voices amongst the psychological community who belittle that research by coming up with statements that deny it. And I'm not going to enter into those arguments, but the problem is that they don't move people forward, because people side with whichever they wish to hear from. And I think it is a fact that no one is ever going to actually prove beyond doubt that little disciplinary smacks inevitably cause harm to children. It's not the sort of thing that's susceptible to proof. There are too many factors involved. I'm not, of course, suggesting it's good for children. It's clearly not. But I think, really, as with violence against women, we should move beyond feeling we've got to prove it's harmful in order to say it shouldn't happen. Women would now find it really disrespectful if we were trying to research the harm done by their husbands beating them. It's not a way that issue is approached anymore. And I think it is a bit disrespectful to children to imply that we're relying on those sort of arguments. One thing that some people say to me is, why don't we first educate parents and teachers before we ban corporal punishment? Well, to me, that's wrong, because this is a right of children now. There's no reason why another generation should wait. And again, I'd refer to the parallel with women, that I don't think anyone now would argue that we should wait for full employment for men and universal anger management courses for men before we move to prohibit routine violence against women in the home. It's not right to think of these things as sequential. It's not fair. Of course, we don't want to punish, to send to prison, to fine more parents for hitting their children. That's not going to help anyone. But equally, if the law is not clear and precise, and if it doesn't, on paper at least, give equal protection to children, it is denying children their fundamental right. So we can't avoid the fact that, as with hitting us, any hitting, any assault should become a criminal offence. At the moment, when it comes to children, the law draws its protective circle not around the child, but around the adult perpetrator, the teacher or the parent. Remove that justification or defence, and the criminal law on assault applies equally to assaults on children. Criminalisation does not have to mean prosecution. There can be all sorts of other supportive approaches to parents, and the law should obviously be implemented in a way that takes account of the special status of children, the special sensitive nature of the family, and so on. But the family is not a no-go area. The state has an obligation to protect everyone in the family. The obligation to protect women is increasingly taken seriously, and the obligation to protect children equally should be taken seriously. But of course, it should always be done in a sensitive way which looks to the best interests of the child. Achieving a ban on all corporal punishment has huge potential for any society, because at the moment children are getting a totally confusing and dangerous message from their parents and from the government, a message that suggests it's completely legitimate to use some degree of force or violence to sort out conflicts. You can see that reflected in international affairs, in the violence on the streets and everywhere else. And I don't think we should be humble in suggesting that there is a huge potential for reducing all forms of violence in society if we can stop or reduce and then stop this deliberate violence against children.